Something else we can do is stop your video so nobody is just looking at your chin. See, so we'll stop you here, and all they're gonna see is this.
Well, okay, I gotta go to play. We should take up more screen.
Back up and running and reinventing the whole process. So a little housekeeping first. There are 2 bathrooms at the back of the room. There's water right around the corner, and I even brought cookies.
Someone needs to mute themselves here.
If you don't eat them, I have to take them.
Can someone who's facilitating the meeting and mute the person who's talking?
That's where I want to be, okay.
Let's see. I'm leaving something out. Let me get my list.
I'm gonna go get rid of
This is unceded land from the former property of the Weock tribe. We'd like to recognize that this is unceded and they didn't give it up voluntarily. They're still a part of the interpretation that goes on here and part of the history of this place. So tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Jerry Rohde. And since the room is full, I suspect everybody here knows Jerry Rohde. Have you all been to a Jerry Rohde talk before? Yeah. Well, yay! What's great about that is everybody wants to know about the layers involved in where we live. So I've listened to Jerry talk about tribal communities, the gold rush era, the bad stuff that went on with the gold rush era, more recent history, and he's teaching a class now with our own layer on sea level. So he's even involved in the future. And did we do it, Terry?
We're doing it right now, hold on. We've got, everything is under control. Okay.
Cookie bread. Did you try? The oatmeal raisins are outstanding. There's juice back there. Are you ready?
Looks like it.
Jerry Rohde.
Well, I'm very happy to be here tonight. This is the first public presentation I've given since COVID.
Wow.
If you don't count being on Matter a couple of times. So I'm a little out of practice looking at real people instead of doing a Zoom session. This presentation was based on this book, which is actually a report that I did originally for Humboldt County about 4 years ago. It dealt with the east side of Arcata Bay, between Eureka and Arcata, the corridor that you usually travel between the 2 places, and first few miles inland of that, going back to the mountains. And what I wanted to do tonight was share some of the information from the book and some of the photos from the book, and kind of use that as a bridge to the work I've been doing with Alderon Laird regarding sea level rise. And that was one of the driving forces behind doing this book, to sort of provide a historical context for what we're going to be facing in the future, because this area right out back here is going to be one of the first areas to feel the impacts of sea level rise. So we've got a stock shooter painting here of Eureka Slough, the lower end of it, not too far from the freeway bridge. And it's an endangered landscape we're going to be looking at. And this is the area primarily. Highlighted in a sort of gold color are the lowest lying areas, former wetlands that were turned into dry lands when these areas were diked in the 1890s and early 1900s. We'll look at that a little bit in a minute. And of course, the 2 major travel corridors, or 2 out of the 3 that connect you with Arcata and Eureka, Highway 101 and Myrtle Avenue, Old Arcata Road. Of course, the third ways off screen here across the snowy bridges. So as you can see, the area of interest, the area at risk here includes several miles, about 6 or 7 miles of Highway 101, and portions enough of the old Arcata Road area to actually shut that down should it revert to wetland. And so we take those away, don't have transportation out anymore. That's where the ferry comes in. Used to go between Eureka and Arcata on a regular basis, at least as far as the wharf that used to be out here in Arcata Bay. Anvil, I believe, is the one pictured here. There are several of these ferries that made that trip. And one of the things we're going to have to do here, should be already thinking about it, is are there alternatives to our transportation corridors that exist now? And is it prudent to think about installing ferry service or using the bay as another type of transportation corridor in some way? Because it's not at all clear that Caltrans is going to keep raising the height of Highway 101 to keep pace with the influx of water that will be coming. So let's start off down at the south end of these areas. This is, of course, will show up. You see my, oh, it doesn't want to do that. Okay. Well, what we're looking at is Eureka off to the left, and then the start of the sluice system here on the right. You just saw a brick pop up. That's where Brickyard used to be on the Eureka Sluice. We'll look at that in a minute. And not too. Okay. Let's see if they'll let me do it now. There they all are. These are sites we're going to be looking at in a minute. It just kind of places them for you along Old Arcata Road and along the, or actually in this case along Myrtle Avenue, and also in the slough area. But this map, which came from the book, shows you that there are several sloughs that feed into Eureka Slough. 3 of them right in northeastern Eureka, and drive Myrtle Avenue along, you drive over all 3 of them all the time. And then we also have Ryan Slough that you cross when you come down from Middletown on your way out, saying Freshwater. You have Freshwater Slough that comes in by Freshwater Quarters, and Phase Slough, which actually comes up to Walker Point instead of the news because of multi-thousand square foot mansion that's there coming down. So if we move up that slough area, this is Highway 101, and the first highway bridge that was used up until, I believe, the 1940s. A lift bridge, so the entire center section of the bridge had to come up because Eureka Slough is considered a navigable waterway. And in fact, for a long time it was. We'll look at that a little more closely in a minute. You can see actually there is a ship coming through there when I took this photo. Same thing with the Northwestern Pacific Railroad Bridge. That also for years had to be kept in operating order, even though no one used it. Technically, it's a navigable waterway, and you had to be able to keep it open. In this particular case, by the time this photo was taken, the main activity that required having ships go in there were to bring logs that would be stored in Eureka Slough or something else. Now we're looking at an aerial photo of the next little phase of Eureka Slough. The last photo would have been just off to the far upper left of this photo, where the highway crosses it. We see Jacobs Avenue. This is an old, roughly 1950 photo. They're just starting to build the various businesses on Jacobs Avenue on that kind of strip of land there. Incidentally, Jacobs Avenue kind of sits on a peninsula because Regus is so large that it actually almost isolates this lower area that has Jacobs Avenue on it. And they actually have armored the slough with dikes on the south side and on the north side of the slough. But the bay side of this area has never been armored, and you can see there's wetlands still up there to the north of the highway 101 corridor. Okay, there's a big building right there and a big open space. That is where one of the two brickyards used to be in Eureka. And the other one right there where KINS has its broadcasting studio today. They're located there because there's a good supply of clay in both cases. Right there, they could mine the clay. You can see where they've been digging it out at larger brickwork to the left there. And they each had a kiln. They could fire the bricks there. And there was a wharf that jutted out into the slough where they could take the bricks, which is really heavy, and then barge them out of Humboldt Bay and move to other places. This is really important in the early days because brick was a major building material up here. And you didn't want to have to load tons and tons of bricks somewhere else like San Francisco and bring them up here. So actually there's several brickyards in the county. There's one in Rohde, there's one in Ferndale. There's actually one here in Arcata, just if you are on your way to Greenwood Cemetery, in the last block where there's a duck pond today, that was the brickyard. And the pond, the depth of that occurred when they actually mined the clay there and then later filled in with water. This incidentally also was an area where there were several villages. They wanted to be near the slough. We did a project there at one point in time that required having some archaeologists come out, and it was determined that they would gather sea products, shellfish, things like that, from the bay, bring them to the edge of the slough, process the fish, and leave the shells and things like that, and bring them up to higher ground where they wish to village. And there it is, a Eureka brick. And if you're fascinated by that photo, let me tell you, you can go online to Cal Brick, and there is a devotee of bricks who has a website just about all the brickyards in California. And he has samples like this from the Eureka brick operation. You can actually compare them from colors as well. If you go to Old Town Eureka, you can go to a place like the old, well, Fish Street, post office building there. That was reddish brick from one of the particular brick yards. But then if you get down to where you have, let's see, Bellstar and a series of buildings there, orange brick, that was probably one from the brickworks right here. But in time, they pass on. Now, this is, I think, a very unusual photo. This is freshwater slough, just about where it divides and splits off of the Eureka slough, which would be right far right background. And off to the left is the hillside area of Humboldt. So you actually have passenger ships coming up this far, about a mile up the slough, and it's getting ready to dock here, where passengers can get off and actually take a train in the freshwater area. So they did that sort of thing, bringing people in. They also took the logs out, and here we are in the south freshwater corners. Or southeast corners, where Andrews also right east of the west. In area that used to be called Eddyville, and there's a community there because it was tied in with the railroad that the Excelsior Lumber Company had, and Pacific Lumber Company had. They had plans at one point in time to make it a big town, but turned out they didn't. And instead, when you see what it is today, it's still very rural. But at one time, they had several different tracks coming there. You can see where they have 2 train loads, probably one giant redwood, cutting sections on each of those trains. And then they've actually taken some Douglas fir and kept very long logs for that they might use for some other purpose. And then the 4th train, which is off on the far right, you can't see it very clearly, but that has quarried rock that they're bringing down. And we're at least 3 different locations in back of Arcata Bay where they quarried rock for different purposes and brought them out through the wetland area. Oh, if you have any questions, just say something or raise your hand. Okay.
We have some Humboldt brick
Yeah.
without the D in it.
Yeah.
Do you know the age of that?
No, I don't think I've seen that before, so I'm going to refer you to the Cal Brick website. And you can match it up there. I think she got a photo of bricks from about 6 different brickyards up here in Humboldt County. So we actually came from Humboldt County. They probably show up there. It's an area that I haven't gone into great depth of study on, so I can refer you to it, but I can't tell you for sure which one. This is actually the exact same train, probably shot by whatever company was doing the postcards, same day. If you look at the middle of the 3 train engines there, you'll find that the configuration of the logs match up with the configuration there. What's happened here is this train has gone about a mile closer to Humboldt Bay. Instead of being over near Ann Pearson's place, it's gone across Myrtle Avenue and gone through the Freshwater Corners area. And on the rail line they had then, it's coming up to the edge of Freshwater Slough. And they're actually going to dump these logs into the slough, and then it would be floated down to a particular lumber mill that was on Humboldt Bay. You got to remember that in the early days, before they had even the rail lines, they had to use the bay as a way to transport logs to the mill. And they'd actually float the logs all the way down to Humboldt Bay from, say, Elk River or from the Freshwater Slough area. And eventually rail lines came in and managed to shorten and make the trip more efficient. But we didn't have trucks to haul cut lumber or logs any great distance. We didn't have the road system. So they relied for quite a while on the waterways. And there's a big section in that book about how each of these sloughs was a transportation corridor for logs. In fact, there's a photo in one of the chapters that show Elk River, probably in about the 1880s. Elk River, where they have 2 covered bridges and goes up to the old ghost town of Fall. And it's just filled to capacity. It's summertime, there's not much water, but there are huge sections of old growth redwood logs that have all been moved into the riverbed. And they would build a splash dam behind these logs and start building up a bit of water there. Then they would wait for the first really big rainstorm of the year and knock away the temporary dam. And if everything worked well, there'd be this onrush of water that would sweep the logs with it going down the river and actually bring it into Humboldt Bay. That was the theory. But the problem is, after you do that a few times, the logs are banging away at the riverbed and you get everything silting in. One rancher there had been right next to Elk River for, I think it was about 10 years. And he said that the depth of the river itself had risen, that'd be the bottom of the river, had risen about 9 feet with siltification. You might remember a few years ago when Pacific Lumber Company was still logging out there, how some of the local people were vociferous in their complaints about the siltification of the river. Okay, well, anyway, this is in one sense, a similar process because they're dumping things into the sluice system and then letting the water move it downstream or downriver. And here they are, they're actually dumping into the bay here. And these might be the same people that were taking, were on that little boat that we showed you a little while ago on a tour of the operation, watching them dump into the bay.
Jerry, I'm just gonna escape for a second so I can get rid of this message. Okay, I'm gonna put you back on and then let's see, how does this sound? People online are saying it doesn't sound well. Does this sound better? Okay, all right, sorry for the interruption.
Well, that's good. Okay. So here we are back in the freshwater forests existed before the Excelsior Lumber Company and then Pacific Lumber Company logged everything. So you had not just on the lowland areas around Freshwater Creek and Freshwater Slough, these mammoth redwoods, but then going up the hillsides. And of course, if you've gone out to Freshwater and gone up toward Kneeling, you can see evidence of fairly recent logging there in a number of places. But before they did it, you could drive for several miles on the flatlands of freshwater and see sites like this. But then you had off and on about 60 years of logging of that area. So probably an initial cut of most of the trees, but then a second cut of trees that had grown back in maybe 60 years. And this is the result. That's above freshwater, 1923. Pacific Lumber Company has been out there for about 17 years by then. And this is, you might actually have seen this site if you were going up towards Kneeling, it would be fairly close to that. But all of the hillsides for miles and miles around were logged like this. And then the logs, one way or another, went down to Pacific Lumber Company's mill at Scotia and were cut there. But we look at the devastation there and it looks terrible and it looks like it's a crime against nature. But the result of that cutting allowed people to create houses like this one we see made out of redwood shingles in the Berkeley area. It was built around 1900. And I don't know how many of you people have ever worked with redwood or had a piece of clear heart redwood in your hands, but it's almost magical. I managed to have a few pieces of that once and did a little work with it. And wood is buttery soft. The grain is just perfect. It's, you almost want to pet it. It's like almost feeling it's alive. And I can see where there'd be a great urge by certain people to have that material as paneling for their houses, or as they did with a lot of the shingle style architecture in the Bay Area, they would use redwood shingles on the outside. And after a while, they would weather to this beautiful gray shade that you've probably seen. Let's see. If Raleigh Lamberson were here tonight, he could answer this question, but I doubt if anyone else in the room can, but I'll ask it anyway. Let's see. Does anyone here know what a Humboldt 1000 is? That's what I thought. Well, now we're going to have about 25 or 30 people who will know the next time that question's asked. Because I'm going to tell you, someone with a great sense of promotion, but also paying attention to the quality of the redwood, determined that the redwood in Humboldt County, even the sort of secondary wood that they were using for shingles, was so superior to redwood shingles coming from other places that you could stretch the shingles farther apart. You know how you lay down a course of shingles and another one above that, and you could actually separate the courses by several inches so that you would have the equivalent of 1,000 inferior shingles with only 800 Humboldt shingles. So a Humboldt 1000 was actually 800 of these superior shingles. And I don't know if they were ever tested rigorously to prove that point, but that's how they got away with not having to provide so many shingles for people. And here's a shingle mill. This if you drove out to the end of Park Street in Middletown, past Lafayette School, and you actually go down off the top of the kind of plateau area, the Park Street ends right down by Freshwater Slough. And if you got out of your car and walked a couple of 100 yards to the north, you would be at the site of the McKay and Company shingle mill, where it used to be. And they were bringing redwood down from the Ryan Creek area and back in Putnam, and bringing it here, where they'd either make it into shingles or they would dump logs into the slough and take it down to the McKay and Company mill, which was, about where the rescue mission is today in Eureka, down 1st, 2nd Street, A and B streets. That mill caught on fire in the 1930s, and it's probably the most exciting fire they ever had in Eureka. It was covered about 2 blocks and had a bunch of wood there, and everything was wood around it. They had the Northwest Pacific Railroad had a fire car that they used on fires that they managed to bring in. They had tugboats in the bay that was trying to pump water onto the fire. They managed to keep it from burning the other buildings, but Excelsior Mill was a total loss. So now we're up in the slough system. This is Fay Slough, and when you get up to sort of the northeastern end of Murray Field, the sloughs divide there. Eureka Slough, which is big, comes there and it splits. And one slough goes off towards the mountains, that's Freshwater Slough. The other heads out towards Walker Point and Indianola, and that's Fay Slough. And this is an example of how the sloughs are dealt with currently. Almost all the land out there behind the 101 corridor is private land, except where they, near Fay Slough, where they do have some government land for refuge. But the landowners are responsible for maintaining the sloughs, and there's no rules. Some of them actually armor the sloughs. I'll have a couple pictures of that, I think, later. Or some of them just leave it and let vegetation grow on the sides of the slough and hopefully keep it in place. So one of the main things we're concerned about with sea level rise is failure of the sloughs. And if you have say a extremely high tide and a storm event, you could actually have the sloughs being overtopped. That's happened in a couple of cases in the last 20 years. And that's going to start happening more and more as the ambient level of the bay rises. So when that starts happening, maybe if it's not a big overtopping, nothing much will happen, but it can eat away at part of the slough. You start getting an opening, the water rushes in, the slough, the dike on the slough disintegrates in sort of a successive fashion, moving out from the center. And you could have a very big breach. Then you'd have flooding behind that. Some of the water would go away when the tide subsides, but some would stay there. And then you have this big hole you have to fill. So that's one of the concerns, is how are you going to maintain the dikes when no one has to do anything about them now? They can, some of these dikes have not probably been maintained since the 1890s when they were built, as far as repairing them. So they're going to be under more stress all the time. The other problem is, even if the dikes hold, you can have groundwater seepage when you have extremely high tide in the bay, and all of a sudden you have groundwater coming up behind the dikes, sneaking under the barrier, so to speak, and creating probably a smaller version of the problem you'd have when the dike broke. That's the most unusual drawbridge I think I've ever seen. It was on Devoy Road, took you to Devoy Ranch, which is off to the left of this photo. And there still is a Devoy Road. The Devoy Ranch once covered most of the wetland in the Eureka Slough system. And since then, there's been a couple of different versions of a road there. Now it has a concrete bridge. It's, it's on Myrtle Avenue, about a mile after you come down off the grade from Myrtletown. And it would be the only left turn you can make anywhere along there. But this was, I think, the first version they had. You drive by this every time you're on Myrtle Avenue. It's about a half mile west of the land trust property by Freshwater Corners. This would be as you're driving in towards Eureka on the left side of the road. And there's a beautiful pond there. Well, the pond results in the damming of what was called Tannery Gulch. Used to be a leather cannery. And they would actually take advantage of the water course there. They needed water, for one thing, because they were creating pools of tan bark enriched medium that was actually going to tan the hides they brought in. Of course, there's tan oak all over around here, and the various owners of this tannery, including a man named Sass, would get the tan bark from old backcountry, like up in Neyland. You can see property maps with the name Sass on it, and they must have had a very high percentage of tan oak on those properties. In any case, they would bring the tan bark in, grind it up, put it in a sort of pool-like area with water, and then they could treat the hides there, cure them. And after they'd been through a process for a while, they would take them up to the second story and let them dry. Well, you've got several things going on there that are problematic. You've got all of these hides. They have to scrape the hair off of the one side of the hide. They have eventually what's going to be this kind of smelly mess of the liquid that they've been canning them in. And what could be more convenient than to dump all of that into Tannery Gulch and to let it come down into freshwater slough and then out into the bay. So that was the reason why, if you look on a property map, you'll see most of the parcels are done in rectangles, to conform with what the government needs. But in this particular case, you have this strange parallelogram on a diagonal that just covers the Tannery Slough or the Tannery Gulch area. So they didn't have to waste their money on inessential land.
Do you know how they harvested the bark?
Do
you know how they harvested the bark?
Yeah, they go out in the spring, probably I guess May roughly, and they usually work as a team of two. And this was back in the days we had big tan oaks. Nowadays, you seldom see a full-grown tan oak because almost all of them were logged away. And the ones we see now are often understory trees in other locations. But I've been to one place at Humboldt Redwood State Park where they have trees that are 3 to 4 feet in diameter. And I've been told some of them are almost 200 feet tall. So they can be really big. Anyway, they would go in and they would make a cut into the bark with their axe all the way around at a height of about 4 feet, another cut about 3 feet above that, and strip off that one piece of bark. And then they would cut the tree down, but they'd already saved some pretty good bark that way. And then when the tree went down, they would, using that same kind of incision method, they would remove the rest of the bark off the trunk and any of the larger limbs. And then they leave it there. This for summer, and that had a drying effect, so you'd lose most of the moisture that was in the tan bark. And these sections would sort of roll themselves up like a scroll. And so they became fairly compact. And then they would take mules out and load. The load wasn't very heavy, but it was kind of cumbersome. And the mules would bring it to the nearest road where they had a wagon, and the wagon would take it to tan bark works or whatever place needed that particular thing. They had a huge tan bark plant in Riceland near Barberville. In fact, for years, Riceland was the biggest town in southern Humboldt because they had so much tan bark being processed. And got enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry you asked it.
That was me first.
So this is Freshwater Slough, pretty near Freshwater Corners, actually. It is absolutely beautiful. Also in this area, there's been nothing done to any of the diking system there, but there's some pretty good vegetation that seems to be keeping things in place. Now we're going to kind of leave the Eureka Slough area We talked for quite a bit longer about it, but we got to move north. We got to get up here before the program's over. Indianola, kind of a halfway point if you're going out on the alternate route. It's where Myrtle Avenue ends and Old Arcata Road begins, and you don't know the difference until you look at the road signs. Man by the name of Ole Hansen, in fact, there's Ole Hansen Road as you approach Indianola, had a shingle mill, and he owned most of that canyon that Ole Hansen Road runs up. And so he would log that area, and they cut the wood you see back here in just the dimensions for shingle, except that they were in bolts. So then with a shingle making machine, you could slice these bolts into the individual shingles. And what they're doing here is bringing them out to this mill. And one thing with shingles, even with the Humboldt 1000 apparently, you were able to use wood that was not of the ultimate quality that you'd have like for paneling, things like that. In fact, down in Eureka, out by Ridgewood Heights, that area, they actually had, they were doing logging there in the 1940s and 50s of old growth redwood, but because it was growing in an environment with a lot of salt air, it was not first-rate wood. It reacted negatively to the air. And so it was never cut until they cut everything else around there. In that particular case, the wood was processed by a shingle mill out at Ridgewood Height area. And Ernie Pearson used many of those shingles when he was building his houses after World War II. And you probably see some of his houses around, and you would see some of that redwood shingle. Yes.
You've passed phase through. I read at the Historical Society that was named after the Fay brothers.
Yeah.
Who had built a tram.
Yeah.
I've been in a canoe up to the end of phase through. There's a big turnaround at the end of the slough.
Yeah. Well, if you go out Walker Point, Walker Point, the end of the road, you know, and look down, you will actually see the remnants of a railroad trestle that went up near Ole Hansen Road up the canyon, and they actually were bringing down quarried rock there's a rock quarry about a mile east. You know that. Anyway, they're bringing it down for barges to transport out of phase two, and a lot of that rock was used to line the roads and streets in Eureka.
That wasn't for the jetties. That wasn't designed to take rock out to start building jetties.
To my knowledge, the rock from there wasn't used from the jetties, but we're going to get to something about that. If you can hardly wait, you know, to see the rock from the jetties, it's coming. So just hang on. I'll get you there in a minute. So now reclaiming the land for ranching. And this is where it got started, actually up here somewhere in this area. We don't know exactly where, but in the north end of East Arcata Bay, and it could have been near Daniel's Slough down this way a little bit, near Butcher's Slough. They began in about 1893 to use this diking machine, which is basically a steam shovel there's a boiler back there, probably one of the Dolby or Donkey type devices that's powering this. And what the diking machine would do would be to operate close to the bay, but with enough space between where it was working and the bay to build the dike. And you see the raw material that's been processed building that dike behind the diking machine. So they would dig up a bunch of the wetland area and then swivel the scoop and deposit it on the bay side of where they were working. And then they could actually move themselves forward because it's filled in with water, and they can kind of float their way along until they got all the way over to Mad River Slough on the one hand, and eventually all the way down to Eureka Slough on the other side. When they were done diking up in the Arcata area, the owners of the property down off of Eureka Slough bought the diking machine and went down there. So in the 1890s and early 1900s, all of that area was diked off and would have been wetland. And remember when I showed you the kind of golden area at the start, which would have been that wetland area, almost all of that became dry land because now they had kept the tidal action from infusing that area with water periodically. And they would wait for about 2 seasons of rain, so 2 years, and enough rainfall usually occurred that it washed enough of the salt and other minerals out of that land, then they could start growing a crop of forage for farm animals. And so they did a lot of dairy ranching, especially like over, well, we could look out here towards Gannon Slough and Jacoby Creek, and there was a couple of dairies that operated there on this, as they call it, reclaimed land. And for those of you that remember, you could go out on Samoa Boulevard and make a turn and go 1 block closer to the bay on Boulder Road to Samoa. And there used to be a string of about half a dozen of these magnificent, huge redwood barns that are almost all gone now. But those were all built to function on this reclaimed land. Because going inland from there, you had over 1,000 acres in one case where you could have your ranching operation occur. And then, because now they had allowed a new crop, a new plant species to exist there, they had food for the animals, but it was all artificial. It was maintained that way because the dikes held, and because the natural processes, which had been so important to the Weot people, for example, when they would just take their canoes up the side streams and slough, they could, one thing they could do, I think it was just magical. They, in these wetland areas, one thing they would try to gather would be ducks. And they would, one man alone could do this with a canoe. He would make a little platform in front of his canoe, and on that, he would make a little box-like area out of wood that had a hole just in one wall. And then he would build a little fire on top of the canoe and within that box-like structure. And there'd be this beam of light that would come out from the hole that he put there. And he would go to an area where ducks were known to be present. And apparently the ducks at nighttime would gravitate towards the light. There's something about it fascinating. And when several of them came, he had a net. He was about 8 feet by 8 feet. And he'd get ready and he'd just throw the net and he'd capture multiple ducks at one time. Doing that. So that was Weot technology used to provide food. And it was only possible because the Weots were leaving the wetland area alone to do its natural thing. Of course, they were taking something from it. They were taking ducks in this case, but they were being much lighter on the land than the whites when they were trying to transform the area into something completely different. So now speaking, since we're talking now about the ranching areas, now we're down, you see the pink area, that's where the wildlife area is today, near Harper Ford. If you go in, actually Harper Ford is a parking lot just as you go in on the left. And you can walk all the way down to Walker's Point through this wetland, former wetland area that's now gradually going to become wetlands again. But it shows you how massive the DuBois Ranch was. They were the main landowners in that southern part of this travel corridor, and they were the ones who bought the diking machine from the owners of it that operated up in the Arcata area. And what you also see on this map is, I have to point to this. This line right here is the Pacific Lumber Company Railroad came out of Freshwater. We already saw what it was like in Eddyville, but the most interesting part of it, right right down here, Highway 101, the railroad actually crossed the highway there. And there's a photo I chose not to use tonight, it would have been kind of hard to pick out in detail. But there's a string of cars stopped there one day on Highway 101 because the Pacific Limited Company train had to come through. Imagine that today happening on the traffic corridor. But they did up until 1941 when they closed the line.
Did the Du Bois plant the eucalyptus trees?
Big one.
Did the Du Bois plant the eucalyptus trees
Yeah,
along 101?
yeah. In fact, they planted the trees in the 1920s and they had a killing frost and it looked like the trees had died and they cut them all down, and then they sprouted back up. And so you're gonna have a second growth that you see out there today where they left them standing. And you know, some of them are still there. This area, I think is on the Wilson Ranch, which would be near Freshwater Corners, but this is another thing they did out there. Instead of just having pasture lands for dairy cattle, they actually grew wheat. And you might not think of that as something being grown up here, but earlier times, it was tremendously expensive to bring anything up here, especially before they had the railroad. Everything had to come by ship. And so if you could grow a food product, some type of food up here, they usually did it because it was cheaper than having to have it imported from San Francisco by ship or something like that. And so here we have one of their areas where they are growing wheat. You know, they're still in a couple of places like down by Alton and at Camp Grant. There's some wheat being grown. And what was the woman who baked bread for several years?
Red for Bex.
Yeah, yeah, and she was using wheat from Alton, I believe, in growing, you know, contemporaneously. Okay, so northeast Arcata Bay now, we've covered most of the other spots. Let's take a look at that. Brainerd Slough, we're going to focus on a little bit. Most people don't even know it was there. It actually is sort of a dividing point between the Arcata area and the Eureka area on the shore of the bay. Gannon Slough started up near Health Sport over here, and then came down and we actually crossed Gannon Slough on one of the bridges where they've been doing a lot of work recently up near Arcata. Of course, most of you are familiar with Jacoby Creek, and we'll talk very briefly about the quarry up there. But the most interesting thing I see on this map is not one, but two wharves going out to the bay. And there's a lot of confusion about that because you can go right down here, you know, half mile, you can go out by the parking area off of I-3. Yeah. And low tide, you can still see some of the piling for the wharf right out there. So most people who've been in the at the time know, well, there's an Arcata wharf. And that's the one that you see here on the left side of the map. But there's also what they call the shingle wharf. And the shingle wharf came from Bayside, and it went out. If this was a nautical chart, it would show that there's a channel in the bay that comes up here. And when it gets to about this point, you still have depth of about 10 feet or so. So fairly large ships could come in there. They couldn't go in any farther, but they could get to either of those wharfs. We'll look at that in a moment here. The shingle wharf was called the shingle wharf because they shipped a lot of shingles off of that wharf. And here in the Sunnybray area, Harps and Spring have this shingle mill, and they actually had a rail line that would allow them to take the shingles down to the wharf, which was only a mile or so away. But here's the shingle wharf. However, it's usually identified as the Arcata wharf. And that's, I think HSU has it identified that way. It's appeared in books that way. But try to figure this out. If it's the Arcata wharf and you're out in the bay, that wharf does not travel in a direction where you're going to have mountains directly behind you. But the shingle wharf, which goes east, does. It goes right up to the hillside by back to Jacoby Creek, Bayside. And that's what we're seeing here. And so in 1900, exactly that particular year, the shingle wharf caught on fire when there were 4 million shingles on the wharf. So you got the wooden wharf and you've got thousands and thousands, millions of shingles. Well, it got started because the train that would carry the shingles down to the wharf emitted a spark that fell into the timbers of the wharf, and no one saw it in time until it became a real fire. Then the only people that had to fight it was the train crew for a while. Finally, they got word to people at the mill at Bayside, and they came down and started fighting it. No one bothered to get in touch with the owner of the wharf, who lived in Eureka. First thing he knew was people were in Eureka were going down to the bay because there was this bow in the sky, and you could look across the bay and see the shingle wharf on fire. Well, finally, the call went out for help, and a bunch of firemen from Eureka called out one of their force-drawn fire engines and put it on one of the bay ferries, brought it up, and we were able to actually start sprinkling some water on the fire. By then, the fire had actually burned through the wharf, which turned out to be a good thing because it formed kind of a fire break. A bunch of shingles fell into the bay, but now you have the wharf separated in such a way that some of the shingles were not in danger anymore of being burned. However, the shingles that fell in the bay created their own problem because they were on fire and they started floating under the wharf and threatening to burn the wharf from the bottom up instead of the more traditional way. So then they had to send some guys down there to try to put it in. Anyway, it turned out that out of the 4 million shingles, they only lost about 1 million. And remember, these were Humboldt thousands, so we're actually talking about fewer individual shingles. But they were able to kind of regroup and continue to use that operation after they repaired things. But it was pretty exciting on Alaska. And now, since we're connected with the Marsh here we are out at the southeasternmost oxidation pond. And this is the sort of riprap they've done there. And, there's a road that goes along both of those ponds out there. But what do we have down there below the road, right next to the bay? What's that? That is a piece of piling like that. And so one of these times when you're down here, instead of going to all the really pretty spots, go out there to that southernmost oxidation pond and then look down over the side and you'll see a row of the piling, because the corner of that oxidation pond is built on the old shingle wharf. The material left from that follows that line. In fact, well, here's the Arcata wharf. This is the real Arcata wharf this time, not the imitation one, but see if I should. I want to get back to the shingle wharf because they were also bringing down rock. So be happy to know. Now we can talk about rock that went to the jetties. If you go up Jacoby Creek, there were 2 quarries up there. This is an area near where they were quarried, where they also did a bunch of logging. And as they logged in the early 1900s, they just left all the slash and didn't clean things up. And the timber company allowed a shingle man to go in and just pick out any loose pieces of wood he wanted for his shingle operation. And it destabilized this kind of dam they had up there, created a rush of water down Jacoby Creek, and it actually flooded some of the wetlands from the backside and returned them temporarily to wetland. And there we are at the quarry. There's the quarrymen, big crew. And what they were doing mostly with the Jacoby Creek rock was sending it down to the jetties. And here we're back. This is the shingle wharf again. If you look closely, you'll see some shingles stacked over to the side. You see the mountains barely in the background. And here's one of the bay ferries. And what it is doing is hauling this barge. And there are 21 of these small rail cars, 3 rows of 7, and each one is filled with quarried rock. And they would actually fill up the rail cars up in Jacoby Creek and then bring them down by train to Shingle Wharf and then load them onto a barge like this. Then they were towed by one of the ferries or one of the tugs down Humboldt Bay. And now we are at the landing apron, as they called it, for the South Stick. If you look in the background, there here is the area where King Salmon is going to be built. So we're looking sort of southeast. Fields Landing would be, it doesn't show up much in this photo. This is Fields Landing back there. Here is our barge with the 21 containers of rock. It's going to be brought around, backed up to the landing apron. And you see they've got 3 sets of tracks to go into 3 rows of the containers. And they had a dedicated steam engine or 2 there that would then take those containers of rock, little rail cars of rock, and gradually use that rock to build the jetty out towards the ocean. And the tracks would then be extended and they dump the rock before they came up with their current method, which works much better. Almost done now. We're going back to the middle of this area between Eureka and Arcata, where there used to be a ridge line that came through the Indianola area. It actually came out almost to the bay. And it was in one place, it was about 100 feet high. And when it came out to the bay, it sort of made a little point in the bay, and they called it Brainerd's Point, named after the landowner there. And when they wanted to put in anything that went right next to the bay, like the railroad line that they're building here, they had to cut through that cut. They called it Brainerd's Cut then, and got gray cut from that. Yeah. So here they are watching the progress of digging through that massive material. In fact, for a long time, it looked like there were going to be 2 rail lines that went between Eureka and Arcata, and they wound up with just 1. But a second rail line actually started building from up by where the skateboard park is on Arcata. And they actually have a right of way that came down about where F Street would be, unless the freeway took it out. And it went parallel to today's railroad line, a little closer to the bay. And if you go out on the hiking trail along there by Jacoby Creek or Gannon Slough, at some point you can go onto the rail line and look on the bay side, and you'll still see piling there, and you'll see the berm from that second rail line. The problem was, when they got this far, they stopped because they looked at the terrific expense that the other railroad was going to make it through there. And they finally came to their senses and realized that you didn't want to compete. There wasn't going to be enough money being spent on having the rail lines operate to allow them both to make a profit. So they made an agreement where one company used its rolling stock and the other used the tracks. And we only had the 1 rail line, but we still have some of the infrastructure left from that second line.
It looked like it was all clay as opposed to rock.
Well, this shows you 1947. Now they've got the highway in, and this is what's left of Brainerd's Point. And the colorization here is not 100% accurate, but you get to see that mass of material there. And I think some of it was clay. That's what I said. But you also see here how high it was, and this would be about the point where that photo showed them digging through it, about 100 feet high. And gradually, that material that was left was actually brought out to extend the area out here in the breakup on the bay side, where you see in progress, they're trying to build up more of a staging area here for businesses. This is the bay dredge known as Jupiter, that for years was parked down on White Slough by College of the Redwood. You see it as you drove by on 101. It was up here for decades. It did the work around when they were setting up the sewage treatment plant. It did this area here by Grey Cut. It built King Salmon did all of the channels that they put in there. They added to the size of Fields Landing. And then eventually it, went to the old age home for dredges and was there on the slough until it burned to the ground. So anyway, this is an area that was really in play for a while because they were actually, once again, trying to change the landscape. Let me see if I can show you. That about there is where retail lumber is today. And there's the Bay Dredge. And here's the high point of Brainerd's Point. And then right back there is the Bayside Cutoff, just so you can get all of that fixed in your mind. And right about where that last arrow is, you see some ponds of water. That's near where there was actually another slough. And all of this area back behind the point here at one time was almost like a lake. It was a large slough. And then people see their way of doing it. They turned the lower part of the area right down here into the city dump. There used to be the slough and part of this wetland system. And that remained in operation until I think the late 1930s when they built the dump that we used for years up on, is it Pigeon Point Road?
Yeah.
Up there. Okay. And I think this is the last diagram of any of that. So here's the Brainerd Slough area I told you about where the dump went in. Here's they've actually now, by the time this photo was taken, they've carved out the shape of the Bayside landmass by building up the outer edge here using part of Brainerd's Point. And then they put a dike on. They had a plan to make this much bigger. In fact, if you come down to Eureka and go past the break cut area, you see a strange little, it looks like a dike, and that's what it was, but it just goes out in the bay and ends on kind of a diagonal. And that was down here. They're going to make it a large dike here and make this a much bigger area. I think at low tide, you can still see the remnants of the oyster beds there, and it shows up right here on this aerial as being the rectangular areas. And I think that brings us back to the Eureka Arcata ferry. There were several of these, but you can imagine up until, well, let's see, late 1900, it's like 1908 or so, you didn't have through rail traffic between Eureka and the only land route you had was Old Arcata Road and Myrtle Avenue, and that wasn't changed until the highway went in about 1918. So up until then, you had a real need for alternative transportation. Like in 1900, when the Shingle Wharf caught on fire, how did the fire department from Eureka get up there? Well, they took the ferry. Yeah.
Was Humboldt Bay a lot deeper then? I mean, I know there was sloughs going through that are deeper, but it's just so shallow.
Yeah, and I don't have any statistics about that, but there's been so much erosion that has occurred. A lot of it due to logging in the past, and especially a lot of the sedimentation happened when they have the log drives on these rivers or large streams, because they would send them down Ryan Creek, Ryan Slough, also Freshwater Creek and Slough, but especially Elk River. And used to be when they have the log drive that all the logs would come out into the bay. But remember I told you they kept raising the riverbed. And after a while, a sandbar started forming at the mouth of Elk River. And all the lumbermen were just really angry because nature wasn't cooperating and they were causing this problem to begin with. So they actually had to bring down a couple of steam donkeys and actually sort of winch the logs over the sandbar to get them into the bay so they could take them to the mill. But of course, all the problem was due to the way they were sending the logs in the first place. So we'll just come back at the end here. Here we are with our wetland area. Here we have Eureka Slough right out here. And then we have freshwater slough coming up here, going up towards freshwater corners. Rhine Slough coming up to Ryan's Creek and going down to Cutton. And Phase Slough going over here to Walker Point. You can see there are other subsidiary sloughs in the early days, some of which were just cut off completely when they put in the rail line and the highway. And in fact, there used to be several, at a very hard time, part of this area became islands because of the subsidiary sloughs actually reaching the bay at one time. And then over here in the Arcata area, here we have the two east oxidation ponds. So it'll be right here where we have the remnants of the shingles wharf, and coming over towards Daniels Slough, and we don't get quite all the way over the Bad River Slough. You get the general idea of where the at-risk areas are that going to be the first areas to return at some point in time to being wetlands, probably. Well, we don't know exactly when, but it seems like whenever they create a timetable, they're going to have to shorten it when new studies come out. So, Alderon Laird, who knows everything about Humboldt Bay, and I got together and started doing classes for OSHA Lifelong Learning, OLLI, with some of this information to help, I think, give people some background on what the past was like and how that's going to influence what the future is going to be. And, right now there's no sign that anybody at any level of government, or very few people at any level, are taking the problem seriously and are really thinking about what needs to happen and needs to be done. So hopefully, the getting the word out will motivate maybe some of you and other people to try to make that more of an issue, because it's going to be a terrific mess, and there's nothing serious being done right now to deal with the problem. Yes.
You're the czar of fixing this now. Well, you're the czar of fixing this. What would you do? What would your suggestion be?
Now, actually, Alderon would be the person I would defer to on that. But what I would do would be to find the people who have the expertise and fund their work so that they can come up with a plan. And there is no plan right now. And the problem is, one of the problems, like I said, was you've got this area that's going to be very vulnerable because of breaching of dikes. But right now, there's no control over that. There's no regulations in place for the dikes to be maintained. In fact, in the book, in here, there's a number of photos that Alderon took of the condition of the dikes in different places. And some people actually went out and they've armored and concrete, and they built up barriers. Others have just let them go, and maybe there's some vegetation covered there. But mostly it's just the earthen material that was put down there 130 years ago. And it's hopefully, in most cases, held pretty well for now, but it's not going to last forever. But anyway, to answer your question, I don't think enough people have looked at the problem and people with the expertise to make decisions about what needs to be done. And also there's a lack of coordination or cooperation between the different government entities. What really needs to happen is there needs to be some sort of kind of mega entity here that devotes itself simply to this problem and draws in City of Arcata, City of Eureka, Humboldt County, the utility companies. In this area, going through here, you might not notice it, but you have PG&E lines, you have the water lines that are coming from rainy wells out in the Mad River. You've got these subsidiary infrastructures that go right through that area and connect places south and north with either things coming from like the PG&E plant from the south or the rainy wells from the north. Those agencies that are responsible for looking at that sort of thing, not doing any of that. You think PG&E has, devoted a lot of time to it. But Caltrans, only apparently does research when they already have a project. And of course, they have the project right now at Indian Knolls, but they are, for example, are not looking at the most vulnerable stretch of Highway 101 around, which is at the foot of Table Bluff on Hookton Road.
Yes.
Yeah, which, even right now, Salmon Creek is overflowing, and they have to close the old highway, and sometimes you even get a little spillage onto the highway. I believe it's 2 feet above sea level, at the lowest point. And what Caltrans doesn't seem to be aware of, or is not acting on, is that the federal government, which controls the wildlife refuge there, is actually trying to return lands to wetlands. So they're taking out dikes. They're creating a situation where you're going to have more flooding rather than less. And Caltrans has no official awareness of that, no plan to do anything. Apparently they won't unless, for example, they had a project where they had to redo, say, the clover leaf down there on Hookton Street. So,
Sorry, I asked.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's a daunting situation. And, I don't know, I don't think it can be solved, by even one group of people, but at least people can be aware of it and they can take some measures on their own to be prepared for what's going to be kind of a cascading series of events. A lot of us might not be around when it really gets bad, but a lot of us have, we're aware of younger people who are really going to face this problem.
I think they're very aware of the problem and the challenge. Like you said, they're doing it on piecemeal until it's really going to be an emergency, and then because the statewide, the amount of money to deal with sea level rise is off the charts. It's off the charts.
And one thing I forgot to mention, and just reminded me, the area along the coast in California that is going to be hit the hardest is Humboldt County in this area because of subsidence and because of the Cascadia subduction zone on our land without any help from a tsunami or anything like that. It's actually sinking here. Up at Crescent City, it's rising there slightly, but we are actually what I call the canary in the coal mine because sea level rise is going to hit here first along the California coast. And a case could be made knowing that, well, okay, then let's see how you deal with sea level rise by doing something here and by having the funding that it's going to take, because funding to deal with the problem is way beyond the capabilities of any level of government around here. Needs federal money.
The other thing about what people don't know is that a lot of the former salt marshes, because they were always inundated, when the plants would die and not decompose, they'd be kind of trapped in there with sediment on them, and they'd just be like a very redwood log just sitting there. But once they diked it off, it aerated the soil. So now one of the reasons it's subsiding is that stuff that's oxidizing and then the land.
Maybe going more so. Yeah. So, yes.
The area in Gold Bear, what fraction of the bay will that increase? Is it another 50%?
I'm not sure the exact figure, and we need to look at the whole bay. This is just the area that I happen to deal with in this report, and maybe the most sensitive area in terms of what the impacts would be on humans, at least. But you could go all the way around the bay and find, for example, out at Samoa, where they're doing so much for the facility for the offshore wind turbines and the other things. Actually, that peninsula will, at a certain point in time, become a series of islands. And you'll also see the Mad River changing course and coming into Humboldt Bay, and bringing with it now an increased load of sediment that normally go out toward the ocean. So those kinds of things will begin to happen. We don't know exactly when, but what we know is what's started is going to keep going. And it's a question of how fast it happens, not whether or not it happens. So, I can't really answer your question about what percentage, but if you look in the book, remember it's free online, you can make your own assessment with the mapping that Alderman has done at the back, where you can see the entire bay and get an idea. And really, what you're talking about is, in some cases, sort of a reversion to what you had before, but it won't be an exact copy of things. You're going to have mud flats some places. You will have a slough system, but partly because of the alterations, it's never going to go back to exactly like it was. Although I've heard from several people that the Wiyot tribe, for example, doesn't feel maybe the same sense of urgency that some other people do. If they could just take their canoes back out there and build their little fires in the boxes and hunt the ducks, they would be in much better shape. Okay, so I think, let's see, something else. Maybe it's, oh yeah, there goes our ferry still. So, you might invest in, ferry bonds or whatever they're going to use to deal with alternative transportation. And now we're back to Stock's painting of East Arcata Bay, but the start of the bay system there. And I think, yeah, that's it. So that's the end.
So we'll have questions here in the room and chat questions online, but I'm not getting them, so Mark will be asking them. Mark, are you there?
I am here.
Or not? The questions?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, for you. The map that, how we call it would be waterway. Was there some fish gone to extinction with all of the non-anchovies, something similar that used to be utilized to sloughs?
I really can't answer that.
Yeah.
Right. Although you'd be surprised, they actually want sharks. Especially, we're talking about things as they were 150 years ago, so much. And they found a variety of shellfish that were present back in those days. They could, some archaeologists cited middens and find evidence of species that are not. Yes.
Hi, I know this is geography, natural, but I have a question about, like, you showed that picture, that large crew in quarry. There's a couple of those large quarries in the east side, in the Shingle Downs. So I'm really interested in the workforce. Do you know about anything about, like, where they came from? And Suzanne, you're reminded in a recent conversation, they were really young. They were like young men. Yeah, do you know anything about
Well, not specifically as to each of those places. There's been some pretty good information that's come out about the waves of immigrants coming to Humboldt County.
Yeah.
And you find, I saw one study that did it, I think for the last 4 decades of the 19th century, and you saw a shift going on there where only in the 1890s did you start getting people from Scandinavia who then became seamen, operating ships, but also as timber fallers. In fact, sometimes they call the big crosscut saws, they use the Swedish fiddle. Because it was so common. And then before that, you had a whole group of people coming from the maritime provinces came down. And, the town of Scotia, apparently there was a contest to see which name they were going to use, but they were both places in the maritime was, Scotia won out for that. But we had, that group of people. And then, we shouldn't forget also, the agriculture. We had groups of Portuguese that came in and other people who were into dairy, especially. In the early 1880s, there were over 80 dairies at Bear River. Bear River place.
So with the industry, the logging, so the company owners went out and recruited around in different places and brought them.
I haven't read enough to tell you much about. But one thing I've seen evidence where there'll be communications between timber companies here and other places, and they would, like, one owner would write it over and say, I need some men, do you have any? Can you send them up here?
Yeah.
I've not read about them actually going out, like to Los Angeles and kind of having like that. One thing we do know is that a lot of these loggers, especially, they shifted around a lot. They might only work for a few months at one particular place, and then something would set them off. They get drunk or something, or they didn't like the food, and they move on to another place. And a lot of them are kind of almost itinerants up to a point. But you're asking a good question that I've yet to read. Systematic study of that. Just bits and pieces.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
I think I remember you talking one time about just how energetic lumbering was.
Yeah.
So a young man worked how hard?
Well, okay, so if you were a chopper, for example, where you were cutting usually at least a 10-hour day, you were chopping down redwoods. And a big redwood would take 2 choppers a week to cut when you had hand tools. When you had the double bitted axe and you had the misery whips, the long saw. So those guys were burning over 7,000 calories a day. So roughly 3 times the amount that you might say a male would be eating today under normal circumstances. And even during World War I, they determined that when soldiers were in combat and really exerting themselves, they needed about 5,000 calories a day. But these guys surpassed that, 7,000 calories. And you don't see any fat loggers.
Wow.
So these guys, were on the one hand, they were doing all this aerobic work, they had strong muscles and, good cardiovascular system, but they were wrecking themselves in other ways. A lot of them drank heavily, and then the number of deaths and injuries. I did a short study in the Times Standard, well, it was the Times in those days, in I think the year 1913. I just looked through. I started in the height of the logging season, like maybe July, and looked on the front page because whenever there's an accident, it always wound up there. But I would find, like in a week's time, you might have 2 or 3 deaths or serious injuries. It was kind of like a sports report, old logger out in the Carson Woods, lost his arm or something. And what some people don't realize is that actually in the logging process, lumbering process, there were 3 real places where they could get killed or hurt. One was out in the woods. Another was on the train system, bringing the logs into the mill. And then the mill itself, where guys would lose arms or limbs there, being caught in the saw or something like that. So you had a lot of people either being killed and crippled and without any backup, really. You read cases where some logger with a family was killed, and the mill owner or the woods owner, might give the widow a few $100 out of the goodness of his heart. But there was no real provision made for what happened to those people after that.
Joint issues, arthritis, things like that.
Well, a lot of them didn't. A lot of them didn't was long, but their bodies took a tremendous beating. And in some cases, I think if they're a loyal employee, you know, they might find some work for them to do that wasn't so strenuous after a while, but you couldn't count on that.
Yeah.
Mm,
Pretty much on there.
Yeah,
Wow,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
The Union Labor Hospital was founded in America. The guys were paid $10 a month or something to be able to take care of the logging.
Because I felt bad for having to ask something you already explained, but I missed the part where you explained break. It was right near the point.
Yeah, and then when they built the railroad, and I showed that picture when they had the steam shovel working, they cut it. They cut through the point, so it became Brainerd's cut,
Oh.
Ray cut because of the building the.
Thank you so much. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Oh, so they would cut, like sort of like, where they would cross the freeway, it's like you were showing towards the end where they would, literally just like cross over the freeway,
Well,
that kind of cut?
Well, you saw the picture where there's a kind of guy standing looking and putting through the material.
Oh, yeah.
And so then the next slide after that, I'm going to show how high the point had been.
Oh, that's right.
See, it was, at that point, very near the bay, it was almost 100 feet high. And then, because of the railroad especially, you had to be almost level.
Oh,
So
okay.
you had to cut down almost 100 feet, but you were cutting through Brainerd's point, so then you got Brainerd's cut.
I got it now. Like, I had to ask because it made me crazy if I drove by it and didn't know it after I knew you knew.
Yeah, okay.
That's cool. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
for the time. It's great.
You're welcome.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, I'm a hydrologist, just working for Helton. I'm actually looking at Hookton Road right now.
You are. Well, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
Because everything I've heard up to now is that it wasn't really on the radar, but it is going to be, it looks like.
Hopefully, I'm in a brand new position in Caltrans. They're just starting a climate adaptation plan.
Right, yeah.
And so I'm doing really early scoping and research.
Good.
And so actually I'm starting a feasibility project for Hookton Road.
Oh, good.
And it's gonna go through a bunch of motions. Hopefully it doesn't take forever.
Yeah. Well, just knowing that even that's being done is encouraging because, you know, up till now, it doesn't seem like anything's happening.
Yeah, I understand Caltrans and governments have their specific things that they focus on.
Yeah, yeah.
It takes a long time. But I also wanted to mention there's a new Sea Level Rise Institute.
Yeah, the one at HSU, or is this something separate?
So there are kind of two different groups going on. HSU, they have their own Sea Level Rise Institute.
Right.
But then the Caltrans started a contract with HSU because we have to submit a plan to the Coastal Commission and the federal government. And we have 2 years to submit a plan for the corridor.
Yeah. Will you be able to make your deadline, do you think?
We'll see. We have a contract with HSU for 1.5 years to do all the research, and then after that, we'll make